Video Games Europe, a game industry lobbying group in the EU, has responded to the Stop Killing Games initiative, and it's about what you'd expect from a lobbying group. We all expect them to be against it, of course, but it is a bit embarrassing for them that they actually misunderstand the petition, using many of the same arguments as random people on the internet who are criticising it, which, clearly means they haven't fully read the petition or understand what it actually asks for. Luckily, they have put their criticisms in an itemised list, which makes countering these arguments fairly straightforward. Their first point is about player safety, citing that if they were to abandon the game as requested, then illegal, harmful content could become, widespread, and that is going to happen if you start moderating and censoring your players. However, the first thing they talk about is cheating. Now, we all know that cheating is often widespread in moderated games, so it's a bit of a weird thing to say, we are protecting you against something, well, we're not really doing a good job, but if we stop, it'll become worse. And yes, it could become worse, but the point is the actual ideal scenario that these players want to set up is one where there is probably a small community, and this is actually something they cite later, that it is a small audience, actually in point 3, so it's like, you really think a small audience is going to be kind of inundated with cheaters when it's so community-driven that anybody who does get caught cheating is just going to be ousted and private server, they can never go back onto any of the servers. And really, it's not a problem, this safety, because, these are probably all going to be kind of people who can handle themselves, people who know how to not get into trouble on the internet, mostly adults. And really, game companies don't particularly do a good job at, protecting their player base anyway, except for, an auto-chat filter, which isn't exactly protection. And calling anti-cheat protection is weird because, you're not made unsafe because someone else is cheating. And people know this is going to be a reduced experience. So, half of all gamers don't even want this moderation, and the companies do poor jobs. So anyway, just look at something like Roblox. So in the end, really non-argument, as they're not doing this particularly well, and nobody who's going to be playing this later on is really going to care. Next point is about security risks, with the first one being releasing game code, which is never asked for in the petition. It's just server binaries, and also removing online-only functionality. It doesn't expose you to DDoS attacks because you're not the one running the servers. Data breaches maybe could be a problem. Malware, if you leave important information in your server binaries, or you give your servers too many permissions. Consumers could be, could be the victim of bad actors, malware. All of that is a possibility, but existing private servers already have that problem. So, what exactly is the argument? Are you saying that private servers, player-hosted servers shouldn't be allowed because they have those problems? Or are you saying that, once we cultivate a community that is reliant on us, we can't send them into the Wild West of have a private server because they just get murdered by hackers? It's already a thing. It doesn't make sense to say that having more of it would be harmful when there's already community, ways of mitigating this in place. The concerns about player safety are hollow because they kind of don't make sense, they're kind of self-contradictory, and these companies also advertise gambling to children, so it doesn't really make sense for them to be concerned about their players when they get them addicted to gambling, often on purpose, so that's mostly in the past now. Point 3 is probably their most fair point because, rewriting server code could be annoying, it could take a while, and that's something that the petition doesn't account for particularly well. But also, it probably shouldn't be that difficult. You can probably really just move the server, just one Linux box onto another. You really don't have to make it compatible with every single piece of architecture. It should be, as long as it works on Linux, it's fine. We do not care about working in ways. It just needs to work. We're not asking for some super good server suite. We just want, bare minimum functionality. So that is a fair argument, but it really just depends on circumstances. Point 4 just expands on point 3, though technically more jobs would be created in the short term. and really to some degree, like, fewer risks taken, fewer games made, well, that's already a pretty small number, and most multiplayer games, not very risky. I really don't think, especially for big multiplayer projects, especially new ones you're designing, this is going to be a big thing, because ultimately, in the end, in the long run, it's not a big cost, and if you're developing new games with this law in mind, you're just going to comply with it from the get-go, and so that's not going to be particularly difficult. Point 5 is really kind of on from like point 1. It's people might use the game in a way we don't like. Well, people might do that anyway. What are you going to do? You're just going to censor them. So basically, they complain they can't censor their player base, which is kind of the equivalent of like someone being angry that they use their paper to print works they don't like, or people who have a dozen political stickers on their car. The manufacturer might not like that. I think, most people who are going to not be able to understand that random people saying something in a video game isn't necessarily indicative of the developer are also not going to be able to figure out which video game that is just by looking at the video. So you're going to be safe, so it's not going to actually impact the company. Point 6 isn't really a point, it's just the company might not want to do this, which is kind of the whole point of laws, forcing people to do something they probably wouldn't already want to do, so it's a bit redundant. Point 7 is infuriating because it's basically saying that you can make video game number 5 and tell your players that they're not allowed to play video game number 4 anymore, and they just have to buy it again, which is kind of against the existing laws, as that would be false advertising that you're basically doing subscription service, but you're saying you're selling them the game. You're just going to turn it off in the end. And if this is what it's for, then it would already be against the existing laws. But this is just, very, very nasty. Just make a better game if you want people to play your new one. If your new game is not better than your old game, no, you do not deserve the players. It's that simple. Really understand what point 8 means, because it's saying consumers aren't allowed to create or run modified copies of the games, despite the fact that's not what's being asked for. Being asked for is the server binaries, and for the developer to perhaps modify the game. So does that mean that if the developer edits their game, they can lose the rights of that game? Because that's what it's technically saying here. If you run a modified version, you lose the rights, the company loses the rights. And that never specifies whether it's the company modifying the game or the player modifying the game, because both of those happen. People modify their games with mods, or at least run them, and the company, does that themselves. The consumer also creates modified versions of online games with mods regularly. So is that something that's, means that they lose control of the rights? So if I go into an online video game and I create a mod for it, say Bannerlord, I make a mod for Bannerlord and I play with that mod, does that mean Tail Roads no longer owns Bannerlord because I made a mod for it? That doesn't really make any sense. So again, point 8 is, as with many points in this list, kind of weird and kind of not something you'd expect an expert in the industry to say. Point 9 is actually fair, because it does mean that, if you have third-party systems your servers are relying on, it could make it more difficult. I don't believe that's particularly common, though. But one of the things it does talk about is the copyright of music as being a big part of this. The music is saved and done all locally. It doesn't change any of the laws surrounding that, so I don't know why music would be a concern here. Again, a kind of good point with reasons, and then they just go and talk about something completely irrelevant, which is just strange. Point 10 carries on from point 9, talking about third-party services, which is fair, but we didn't ask for the code to be released, especially not for those services, which are third-party services, so how would the developer have the code for that in the first place? And then it talks about servers running in the cloud, which is kind of weird because, these points are not individual arguments, they bleed over into each other, which is just strange. Again, how well is this formatted? And yes, cloud is used for game servers. Cloud is used for everything, public or private. Everything is running on the cloud. What do you expect? The private servers that people will set up would be running on the cloud. Yes, we understand you will shut it down, but that's the point, so the players can restart it. These aren't really arguments, they're just vague statements written by someone who seemingly doesn't know much about technology and a bit about IP law and hasn't actually read the petition. As for PEGI ratings, I believe online activities are excluded from those. And anyway, it would technically maybe change them, but also it's fairly difficult for someone who you don't want to be seeing stuff to get access to this online stuff because it would be more technical. The rest of the document is just talking about the importance of consumer protection laws, and also that video game companies are really doing a lot to preserve games. Definitely that is the case. We'll give 2 examples, and some of that is Battlefield 1 being put in a museum, a history museum, which is weird because that's not a historically accurate game. So overall, kind of a response that's it's not really kind of connected to the actual arguments. They're really random arguments. They're not well made. So it's just sort of like a lawyer wrote this without actually understanding what the actual technology is and how any of it works. So they don't even read it. They just like heard about it because this seems to be kind of like the points people bring up when they've heard about it, but they haven't actually read the petition themselves. So yeah, it's just a kind of a weird criticism of the petition, of the movement, of the initiative. If you like my analysis, please like and subscribe.